The cross of Jesus is the focus of Holy Week. There are countless artistic representations of the cross. One of the most striking is this, the central panel of an altarpiece from Isenheim in what is now the French region of Alsace. I can remember as a child when I first saw a picture of this painting. I was disgusted and arrested in equal measure, repulsed by the tortured body of Jesus, yet unable to look away. This short talk is about the Isenheim altarpiece and that crucifixion panel in particular. What I hope to show is that the context and purpose of this early 16th century masterpiece, commissioned for a monastic hospital, reveals the vital relevance of the cross of Jesus for our situation in 2021. The Isenheim altarpiece is the most famous work of the artist known to posterity as Mattias Grunewald, but who in his own time was called Matthijs Nithart. Unlike some of his flamboyant contemporaries, we know remarkably little about Nithart's life. He died, aged about 50 in 1528, after quite a diverse career. He had been a designer, engineer, and manufacturer, as well as an expert painter. The Isenheim altarpiece, which he painted between 1512 and 1516, is a single artistic work, what is known as a polyptych. The multiple panels within the polyptych form a unified narrative. Now, the abbey in the Upper Rhineland for which it was commissioned had a particular association with St. Anthony. Its monastic community was part of the Antonite order. Anthony was their patron saint. So here we see St. Anthony in a side panel to the right of Grunewald's crucifixion. Anthony was one of the founding fathers of the monastic tradition. He lived in 4th century Egypt, the age in which Christianity was transformed from a religion which was persecuted into one that was favoured and promoted by the Roman emperors. Before the conversion of Emperor Constantine, Christianities were a spiritual elite, prepared to risk persecutions in this world for eternal redemption in the next. After Constantine, the massed ranks of Roman society embraced Christianity, and it made the faith flabby. At its moment of triumph, Christianity risked losing its spiritual rigour. So, Anthony and others left the comfort of the cities for pioneering lives of prayer as monks in the desert. No longer were they called to resist the evil institution of the idolatrous Roman Empire. Instead, they chose to fight demons in their heads, spiritual battles against inner temptations. Here then is Anthony in another of Grunewald's Isenheim paintings. The saint is locked in a life and death contest with embodiments of evil. They remind me of the wacky grotesques which litter the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, an artist who flourished a few decades before Grunewald. What's interesting about this temptation of Anthony is that several of the demons are afflicted with boils and pustules on their skin. It's a bit like what we saw on Jesus in Grunewald's crucifixion. And this is not coincidence. We've arrived at the second point of connection between the monks of Isenheim and St. Anthony. The Antonite monks were a healing order, and they were dedicated to treating a painful skin condition which they knew as St. Anthony's fire. St. Anthony's fire caused terrible burning sensations on those whom it infected. Victims felt like they were being burned at the stake. An 11th century writer, Sigebert Gamblicensis, wrote of intestines eaten up by the force of St. Anthony's fire, with ravaged limbs blackened like charcoal. Either they die miserably, or they live more miserably, seeing their feet and hands develop gangrene and separate from the rest of their body, and they suffer muscular spasms that deform them. But bodily ailments were only half the torment of St. Anthony's fire. The condition also included terrible hallucinations. I wonder whether these hallucinations were the link to St. Anthony and his vivid spiritual combat with demons in the Egyptian desert. 100 years after Grunewald, St. Anthony's fire was discovered to be caused by the ergot fungus. Ergot grows on ryegrass and so contaminated the flour which was used in the production of much medieval bread. More recent analysis has shown that the chemical composition of ergot is similar to LSD, a probable explanation for the awful psychotic effects of the disease. Sadly, none of this was known in the Middle Ages, when ergotism was a common and incurable illness. And therefore St. Anthony's monastery in Isenheim was committed to the demanding task of alleviating the suffering of those whose skins and minds were inflamed by St. Anthony's fire. Now, the reason for taking you on this whistle-stop tour of medieval dermatology is that it yields the key to unlocking the interpretation of Grunewald's whole altarpiece, and that agonising crucifixion in particular. Here we are faced by a very human Jesus, contorted with pains not only from the nails and crown of thorns, but also from those eruptions all over his skin. On the one hand, Grunewald's crucifixion reflects a late medieval artistic commonplace in its depiction of the intense reality of Jesus' suffering. Look again at Christ's face and hands. But the painter gives a local twist to this artistic tradition by showing Jesus with a body that might have been familiar to the patients and hospitallers of St. Anthony's Abbey. So much for the physical pain. Something of the mental anguish of St. Anthony's fire is captured in the figures of Mary, the mother of Jesus, St. John the Evangelist who is supporting her, and Mary Magdalene kneeling at the foot of the cross. They are tormented in their loving act of compassion, suffering alongside their Lord and Master. Throughout the altarpiece, there are hints of treatments which the monks of Isenheim might have offered to reduce the effects of St. Anthony's fire. For example, here in another panel of St. Anthony, this time in dialogue with a hermit called Paul, we can find medicinal herbs squirreled away at the feet of the two saints. More significant, though, is the image of John the Baptist, which is to the left side of the crucified Jesus. There's something odd going on here, because the Baptist was executed in northern Palestine many months before Jesus died in Jerusalem. By anachronistically including John at the crucifixion, Grunewald has a point to make. John, of course, is associated with baptism, the symbolic washing of Christian initiation. And note how water is dimly visible in the background of this image. It would certainly have been intended as an echo of John's ministry of baptism in the River Jordan, and may also have been a local reference to the therapeutic thermal springs which were near Isenheim. Perhaps there's also a link to the figure of Naaman in the Old Testament. Naaman, a commander in the Syrian army, was blessed with much that a man could want. Had he not been victim of another skin complaint, leprosy? In the narrative, Naaman was ordered by the prophet Elisha to wash in the River Jordan. Despite an initial reticence, the general obeyed, and Naaman's leprous skin was washed clean by the river and restored to a state like the skin of a child. In addition to the involvement of John the Baptist in symbolic washing, his role in Christian iconography is to point away from himself and towards Jesus. Thus, in Grunewald's painting, he is shown with emphatic finger, indicating the one on the cross. And above John's arm are the words attributed to the Baptist in the fourth Gospel: "He must increase, but I must decrease." In these ways, throughout the overlapping imagery in Grunewald's John the Baptist, the artist is telling the viewer where the solution to his problems may be found. With no known cure for St. Anthony's fire, the patients and monks of Isenheim Abbey were reminded by Grunewald's altarpiece that their chapel and sanatorium were adjacent for a reason, and that prayer was a crucial part of the palliative process. The first letter of Peter says that Christ himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins we might live for righteousness. For by his wounds you have been healed. By his wounds you have been healed. Grunewald wanted his viewers to find in his crucifixion a Jesus who was with them in their physical and psychological suffering, offering strength and comfort, bearing their wounds in his wounds. As we begin to emerge from the shadow of the plague which has beset us in our own day, a massive task of recovery and healing awaits us. It is a task that will enlist the attentive ears and the comforting arms of each and every one of us. My prayer this Good Friday is that you will find in the crucified Jesus the one who is with us and strengthening us, bearing our wounds in his wounds, a hope and a light which we can offer to others in their suffering. Grunewald has one last surprise in store in his altarpiece. He knew that Good Friday was God's solution to the problem, but not the end of the story. So at the risk of an Easter spoiler, let's see just one more of his panels. During most of the year, the Isenheim altarpiece was in what is called the closed position. In this arrangement, Grunewald's gruesome crucifixion is front and centre. But then, at great festivals, the panels were opened up for an entirely different scene to greet the viewer. Here on the right, Jesus is rising from the tomb. No longer is the sky blackened. The resurrected Lord is emblazoned against the dawning sun. And look closely, what has happened to his body? No longer are his limbs racked. No longer is his skin traumatized. He is whole and free, the living, triumphant embodiment of our own hope of eternal salvation through him. Here in this final image, the plague which consumed in every sense the life of the Abbey at Isenheim has been obliterated in the greater purposes of God. My friends, on this Friday, which we call Good, we see redemptive hope from the epidemic of sin and from the sinful epidemic. For Christ himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins we might live for righteousness. For by his wounds you have been healed.